January 1547. Henry VIII, supreme head of the English Church, dies and leaves the throne to his 9-year-old son, Edward. This would begin a period of 12 years in which the English Church would see itself go through rapid changes under two separate monarchs. In January 1547, Henry VIII, the man who led the English Church out of papal authority and had himself proclaimed supreme head of the Church, lay dead. His only surviving son, Edward VI, was proclaimed king and supreme head of the Church in his father's place. Henry had been, for the most part, a devout and learned Catholic, whom, after the split with Rome, had attempted to maintain a balance between Catholic and Protestant advisors in his court. However, Henry had entrusted the upbringing of his son to Edward's maternal uncle, Edward Seymour. Seymour was a staunch Protestant and ensured that his nephew was given a Protestant education. Almost immediately, the young king, through his Protestant advisors, began making changes to the life of the parish churches. Images and icons were dismantled, and many of the vestments worn by priests during services were banned. Public processions on holy days were also banned. The Reformation had finally and fully come to England. One of the leading architects of these reforms was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. During Henry's reign, Latin, and not English, was the language used during services. The majority of the diocese followed the Sarum, or Salisbury Rite. However, Cranmer and the other reformers held the strong belief that the liturgy should be in the language that people spoke and understood, English. Cranmer penned his views in a book titled Certain Sermons or Homilies Appointed to be Read in Churches, but commonly referred to as the Book of Homilies. Completed in 1547, these sermons clearly showed Cranmer's views for reform. In 1548, Cranmer finished his work on a liturgical book with rites and ceremonies in English that would replace those in Latin. Approved by Parliament, the rites and ceremonies in this book became the only legal authorized source of religious worship in England, and it came into effect on Pentecost or Whit Sunday of 1549. Its official title was The Book of the Common Prayer and Administration of the Sacraments and Other Rites and Ceremonies of the Church after the use of the Church of England. It would, however, be better known as the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer and its new English liturgies were unique to both Latin Rite Catholics and Protestants alike. Before this, the prayers and rites of the Church were kept in a number of books or documents that also included which readings from the Bible would be used at a service. A book called a missal would be used for masses, while a breviary would be used for non-sacramental services. The Book of Common Prayer was in fact a combination of the two. The Book of Common Prayer started with a calendar and lectionary. The services of morning and evening prayer came next, followed by the order for communion. The life cycle was then mimicked as the services of baptism, confirmation, marriage, visitation and communion of the sick, and burial services followed afterwards. This basic outline can be seen in the Anglican prayer books of today. One of the other changes Cranmer wished to introduce was the frequency at which the laity received communion. In 1549, most English laity received communion on Easter, even though a Mass would be said every Sunday. The only exceptions were for the gravely ill, or at one's confirmation or nuptial Mass. The Book of Common Prayer had the intention of everyone communion weekly. Now, from a modern point of view, one would think that the people would fully support this move. Most accounts tell us that the new liturgies were not accepted very well by the common people. For example, in Cornwall and parts of Devon, a rebellion occurred. The reason is that the people in this part of England did not speak English, but Cornish. At the same time, these reforms were viewed as too radical by staunch Catholics like Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of London, as well as being much too little in reform by such persons as Martin Bucer, a Protestant exilee living in England. Also legitimized during this period was clerical marriage. During Henry's reign, many clerics had married in secret, including Cranmer himself. However, now clergymen were openly taking wives, much like the Protestant clerics in Europe. In 1552, Cranmer completed a new Book of Common Prayer, this one much more in line with continental Protestant thinking. Before the new prayer book of 1552 could be enacted, King Edward died on the 6th of July, 1553. Edward's throne, despite some last-minute maneuvering by his Protestant ministers, was inherited by his 37-year-old sister, Mary. Mary, unlike Edward, and like her father Henry, had been raised a devout Catholic who clung to her faith fiercely. During Edward's reign, she did not conform to the new liturgy and still attended Mass in Latin. Edward did have cause to use this against her, but he tolerated her actions, unlike many of his other subjects. Almost immediately, the Reformation ground to a halt. The Book of Common Prayer was tossed aside, and the old liturgies in Latin were reintroduced. Many of the Protestant intelligentsia throughout England fled to Europe where they felt they would be safe. However, Archbishop Cranmer was arrested and sent to the Tower of London with the other reformers like Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. In November 1553, Cranmer was tried and found guilty of treason. However, Mary and others in her circle wanted Cranmer to be tried for heresy, as he led the vanguard of the reform in England. It is also very likely that Mary wanted revenge on Cranmer for his part in her mother's divorce. On the 20th of November, 1554, Reginald Pole, a cardinal and papal legate, arrived in England so as to formally accept the Church of England back into the papal fold. While attending a session of the English Parliament, its members begged the papal legate's forgiveness for the acts it had passed in support of the Reformation. So on afterwards, Parliament passed acts that allowed heresy trials to recommence in England against the reformers. Archbishop Cranmer's heresy trial did not begin until September 1555. During it, he admitted to upholding all his beliefs and writings considered heterodox by the Roman authorities. In December, the Roman Curia rendered its guilty verdict and deprived him of his archbishopric. Only then was he replaced by Cardinal Pole as Archbishop of Canterbury. Over the next few months, Cranmer signed several minor recantations. Finally, on the 26th of February, 1556, the broken man signed a total and full recantation. In it, he accepted papal supremacy, transubstantiation, and all other Catholic doctrines he had previously refuted. Canon law, along with the civil laws against heresy that were revived by Parliament, required that repentant heretics, such as Cranmer, be pardoned. However, Mary wanted none of this. She wanted Cranmer burned as an example to the other Protestants throughout England. He was taken to Oxford and told to prepare a final recantation statement, which he would read in full view of the public before being taken to his execution. On the 21st of March, 1556, just as he was reading his final recantation, he stopped and renounced his recantation on the spot. He was then hurriedly taken out of the church to be burnt at the stake. As the fires came up around him, he placed his right hand into the fire, as it had sinned first by signing his false recantations. In John Fox's The Book of Martyrs, it states that as he died, he experienced a vision of God, saying, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. I see the heavens open, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." One of the other goals of Mary was to return the religious houses of England to their condition before their dissolution under her father. This, however, was not possible, as many of the abbeys and priories had been destroyed. As well, their vast lands that were previously used for income had been split up and sold. Some religious houses were refounded, such as Westminster Abbey. Mary was referred to as Bloody Mary for the religious executions carried out under her reign. Around 248 people were burned at the stake during her brief reign. Even though few of the common people had accepted all the reforms, they did not view Mary in high esteem. One of these reasons is that Mary was married to King Philip II of Spain, and they felt that she was putting Spain's interest ahead of England's. The Catholic Restoration, however, was under threat from the very first day Mary inherited the throne. Mary had no children, and her only legal heir was her younger half-sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth had been raised in the household of her stepmother, Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, who was a Protestant sympathizer. Although Elizabeth had conformed to Catholic worship during Mary's reign, many believed she was a Protestant. Several attempts were made to prove a case of treason against her, but none could be made. Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558. Only hours later, Cardinal Pole, the Archbishop of Canterbury, died as well. Elizabeth thus became queen of a nation that had seen great religious turmoil in the 12 years that her two siblings had been rulers. She would inherit a relatively weak nation with deep religious divisions, but would lead England into a golden age.